Hello, this is International Master and author John Watson. Welcome to Beyond the Opening. This is a show that deals with positional ideas, and particularly those characterized by a broad variety of pawn structures, which will recur throughout chess practice. It's the pawn structure that determines the typical positional and tactical motifs, as well as where your pieces are most likely best placed. So with that in mind, let's turn to our first topic. Now remember that last week I talked about we saw a few examples of how white can win with this powerful pawn structure c4, d5, e4, which I call a reinforced pawn chain. This week I'll talk about how black can attempt to attack this structure and what his plans might be. Having an advanced pawn chain is an advantage, unquestionably, but it also comes with disadvantages. First, in most cases, white has already spent some time, or white or black, whoever has the advanced pawn chain, has spent a tempo or two in order to establish an advanced pawn chain. Notice, for example, in the advanced variation French, black usually makes the first piece developing move. Also in the King's Indian defense with c4, e4, and d5, as we have before us, black is often castled early with a nice lead in development. So what we're going to do, let's start with this c4, d5, e4 structure. I should also say that some of these interior points can get weak if the center is broken down, whereas black has really fewer weaknesses, even potential weaknesses, on the squares that are closer to his side of the board, which is only natural. So let's talk about this. Let's start with what black's main ideas are. One very obvious one, f5, as you know. We have seen this has the ideas of f takes e4 or of f4, g5, g4. We saw both of these last week. We saw these ideas. This is as in the second one is as in the famous main line of the King's Indian defense. It was unsuccessful in that case. That's obviously not always true because otherwise no one would play it. Let me show you the one in particular, this plan of playing like this, maybe even like this and this. That's the classic line. I'm not going to show you this line because it's basically a very lengthy opening theory line. In other words, anything I showed you would be already covered by opening theory. You can find this attack in many, many books and literally thousands and thousands of games. The ECO codes for the King's Indian version are E97 through 99, through E99. You can even see a very pretty example in my Chess FM interviews if you go way back to the first one with Graham Burgess, in which I was doing a book review and I analyzed an absolutely stunning and instructive win by Mikhail Golubev as black. That's in the archives. Don't confuse this with the interview by Mikhail Golubev himself, where he shows several games but not this long pawn chain variation. So I'm not going to go into that particular thing. We saw f takes e4 last time and how sometimes that's useful in breaking up the pawn structure. Okay, what's other ways of doing this? Another way of breaking up the structure is by playing c4, c5. What would that do? It's like check Benoni defense structure. It comes up especially in the main line of the King's Indian when white plays his knight here and then moves it to d2, that variation which we also saw last week. c5 is a good way to block off white's c5 advance. That's one of white's main goals. We looked at that last week. It's also a typical modern defense structure, the c5 move. And one idea is that after a3, for example, black can play a5. And that will prevent b4 for a while. It'll threaten a4, and we'll see that idea. Anyway, at least it makes it easier to defend against b4. So that's another possible idea. And black can also defend with a5 first, make that move. which might secure the c5 square for a knight, for example, a knight that might travel somewhere like this. But also in some lines, for example, in the King's Indian defense, often black will play c5 anyway, and it'll transpose a line to a line where he plays c5 first. So those are all methods of playing against this e4, d5, c4 pawn chain. And finally, this very interesting one, which is this move. And this move, often in conjunction with this move, constitutes one of the most popular ways to play against modern pawn chains, which is to attack them from the front, even the front first, rather than from the back. In other words, attacking this point rather than the central support point. So I'll show you this in our first sample game. It also applies to the French defense, but let's turn to our first sample game against this pawn structure. Okay, this game is Jan Timman versus Garry Kasparov. It's from the World Cup in Reykjavik, 1988. Notice that I'm not going to be giving you any hot up-to-the-date theory because I think that would be distracting. This is basically a middle game show and a show about pawn structures in general, not hot theory. So let's just make a few moves. Let's start out. You've seen these moves before. It's going to be a King's Indian defense, which Kasparov used a lot in his early career and really is almost the best opening for showing this c4 d5 structure. Certainly not the only one. There are plenty of them in the English opening, for example. But let's go ahead and take a look at this. This is all the same-ish variation. It's all sort of well known. And we get to this position. There we go. So that's the plan that I was talking about. Is attacking the front of the pawn chain first. In fact, he's not even ready to play attacking with f5. He's simply attacking the front of the pawn chain first. So after this, white plays simply that, develops piece, and this is sort of our basic position here. Now, black at this point plays kind of a crazy move. Boom. And we'll talk about that move. It's an attack, it's a thematic move since it attacks the support of the central pawn. That's what you're trying to do, is break these pawns down. And there's the idea that by attacking that, you're loosening the support of that. Now, naturally, there's an issue of whether this works tactically, but Kasparov was confident enough to play it. Many people have played this later. Instead, just to show you what a sort of a normal line is, a more popular line, we could look at, for example, this, this, and this, where white can at least claim that he's eliminated one support of the center, and that later on he can probably attack that center this way. So just for example, it might be worth taking a quick look at a variation here. Here, this is sort of the main line. You'll see this quite a bit. Here, now black prepares to advance. Here, here. And now, because of that possibility of that theme with this, which would actually be pretty effective here. Remember last week he didn't have this bishop to help support that attack. And because of that idea, white simply breaks this up. And this is a complicated game. I think white probably stands a little better because of his space advantage, but at least see how black has undermined the e4 and the c4 support for that d5 pawn. So he's broken down the pawn chain. Now at some cost, because white has active play, and the more active pieces, more space, which is probably the most important thing he has. So this is not a total solution for black necessarily. It's been played quite a bit. But let's go back to the game now. See how that goes. Okay, there we go. Now he plays this move c6 first and then b5. So what is he up to? Well, in the game, white took this pawn, very natural move. Let's real quickly look at what would happen if he played this other very popular move. a3 has probably been played as much as anything else. It's a favorite move of grandmasters because it stops this move b4 for one thing, gaining space and chasing the knight away from the center. Black would play this move, and this move, and this move. And the idea is it's a little harder for white to get his attack going on this side of the board. Sometimes at this point white does play b4 anyway. Black plays here, so we can retake with a piece on that square. Nice outpost. White plays here, and black plays for f5. So this is a sort of a standard position. Again, trying to break up the pawn chain or extend it. And so white doesn't want to allow that extension. So white takes, Black takes. Here we go again. This did lead to a draw in one high-level game. I still like white by a bit, but it's not that much. Certainly it's playable. The most entertaining move by far, though, the more interesting move and more thematic move in many ways, comes in this position, where after a3, black simply decides to ratchet up the pressure on the support point with this kind of crazy move. And let's just look at this for a second. For example, here, and the whole idea here is to play here. So you can see that there's a trick going on here. For example, a standard line goes here, and you might say, well, what happens if he plays wins a piece? But it just turns out that after that fork winning back the piece, black's known to get equal play, and that's plausible. Leads to approximately an equal, often into an equal end game because everything gets exchanged off. So, but you'll have to take my word for that one. So the variation I'm looking at instead is c takes d5, but white just simply takes back. Okay. Black comes back again. Now black's a pawn down, but he's putting pressure there. So he's broken up the center. He's broken up the support points again. So this is all sort of theory. It's not real major theory. After this move, the problem is this pawn is starting to hang against moves like this. So white reorganizes this bishop, and now generally knight b6 has been played, and in fact this is kind of interesting. It's a little bit like, you may recognize it's a little bit like a Benko gambit. Black goes permanently a pawn down, but has a lot of pressure here and has pressure down these queenside files. And one thing he might try to do is this, adding another piece to attack that pawn and regain it, which usually happens. It's very complicated. But a much more interesting and typical break, let me show you this, is for him to skip knight b6 and simply play this very nice move, which is a transformation that you should be aware of. It's something that is played in a lot of King's Indians if you get the chance. It puts white 2 pawns down. One idea is if white doesn't take the pawn, he's going to get kicked by this beautiful knight on an open file, which in this case is forking some pieces, but even if it wasn't, it's a wonderful piece. In order to defend the pieces, I suppose something like this might happen. Pretty soon, white at least loses some material. So definitely white doesn't want to play that way. So you might ask, well, why doesn't he just take it? Why doesn't he just capture it? There's a couple ways to capture it, but this is the most natural way to capture it. Excuse me, let me go back there one. It's the most natural way to capture it is there. And then black's idea is to win the e5 square completely and the dark squares, and have an open file against this weak backward pawn. Okay, he's 2 pawns down, but he's immediately gaining a tempo on this piece, and it's going to be a very difficult position to defend, as even his king side's a little bit open. Just for example, he could play here. Black gains another tempo. White has to move that bishop somewhere, maybe here, and maybe black has several moves here, but one way to do it, I suppose, is just to go here, and he's attacking that square. White can't castle. There's the idea of playing bishop e3. There's ideas of playing queen h4 check, rook e8 for sure, knight c5. There's all kinds of possible moves. This is plenty of compensation. So what else could be played? A more natural move would be to play this, for example. Just opposing the bishops, try to get some simplification here and get castled. The problem is after that move, white has more problems, because now if he castles, for example, this bishop e3 check, followed by queen h4, unless white takes the bishop, in which case black at least wins his material back. So in other words, I don't think this is necessarily best play, but that's difficult, and he probably has to take that and give back the exchange. And then black still has an open file and a nice outpost point, although white has some play too because he has some space. However, I'm sure black would be happy with this, which is the main point. So that's a long deviation, but I think it shows you some of the ideas that are going on. It's worth playing over again. In the meantime, let's go back to the game. There's the game. And what did white actually play? He didn't play the move a3. We were just looking at a3, and then we were looking at the cute little reply bishop a6, which was based on the idea c takes b, c takes d, with the fork threat, just to kind of remind you where we were. But instead, white simply took the pawn, black took, white took, And now Kasparov plays, guess what? That move again. This is the same idea except in sort of a more radical form because now white can take with a variety of pieces. But it's a great structure to know. This is a pawn structure that comes up in way more than just the King's Indian. This is a very typical break. What's the idea? Well, this bishop has been suffering behind this pawn for a long time, and now it's extended all the way down. It's got a huge scope. So that in and of itself is worth quite a bit. And on top of that, black seems to be opening up this file. And it's happening with tempo. What he's doing is happening with tempo. So we'll see how that plays out in a second. White plays knight takes e4. Okay, let's take a quick look at pawn takes e4, just so you can see what the ideas are here. There we go. And guess what? What's black going to play? Could play something like rook e8, but the standard idea, you want to move quickly, is there. Winning the dark squares again. Attacking this piece. Now that piece you can see is incredibly valuable for white because it covers all of the potential weaknesses. The queen h4 checks, the pieces on this square and this square. So really that piece has to be protected, and there are a lot of possibilities, but here's one of the better ones for white is simply to play there. But then black plays here, threatening this. And just for example, if white stops that, black can break free. He's just opening lines as fast as possible. And this suddenly has become very difficult for white because there's just so much activity going on here. There's so many pieces that are active. And of course, black can play like that and bring another rook to the file. Very, very nice position. And he's, I guess, 2 pawns behind, which really doesn't mean much when you've got this many threats. Okay, let's revert that. There we go. So also, okay, that's if f takes e4. So what he actually played was knight takes. But of course, then black can take the d pawn. Now this is interesting. White's still a pawn ahead, but look what happened to the pawn chain. It's one reason to show you this game. I mean, this was this massive pawn chain. We talked about what an advantage it was for white to have pawns on those squares. But in fact, there's no pawns on those squares anymore. Of course, white is a pawn up temporarily. He has his own weaknesses, and the game is double-edged. So what happens is white, worried about possibly the fact that black will just consolidate. Also, he has a threat here, and he has moves maybe like this and this. Maybe he's going to get out of the way and move his central pawn, which is a passed pawn. White does a very intelligent thing. He forces what amounts to a queenless middle game because black doesn't have any better move than this, check. White doesn't have anything better than this, and we get into this queenless middle game. Of course, the one thing white has to give up there is an extra pawn. So now we're back to even material. So this is just a game, but you'll see how it develops. Very interesting, actually, the way it develops. We're past the point of talking about structure, really, because the structure in the center is cleared out and is about to clear out even a little more. So it's no longer but it is interesting to look at middle game activity. And actually, in a sense, the pawn structure is still very important because there's this potential passed pawn on the queen's side, but you'll see how important it is that there are squares like this and vulnerable squares. Kasparov did not like this move, knight takes d6. And since white starts losing time again, he's probably right. So that attacks the bishop on d3. He retreats that. Oh, now look, see, these bishops are starting to look awfully nice. Look, the knights are centralized. The bishops have a lot of scope. These knights are very centralized. And presumably he might even gain more time by attacking that knight. So let's just keep going here. Knight retreats. And black simply defends that, but defends with activity. Okay, so now he takes that. He doesn't want to. Black doesn't want to absolutely. Black forces him to take with a bishop because the bishop was hanging, and white tries to make the bishop commit. Doesn't want to lose the 2 bishops and have that dominant bishop on d5. And then this move. Really an excellent move. Maybe the key move in a way. It might have been about even without that. Now you're hitting this a2 pawn, and these pieces on the d file are looking a little awkward. So now it's just much better pieces. And this knight's actually pretty handy here. It's got a lot of nice squares to go to. So really black's pieces are just simply better than white's pieces. So he's a pawn behind again ever since knight takes d6, but he's in very bad shape. Let's just see how this goes. So white makes it's probably a forced move, I think. And black just keeps getting more and more activity. White gets at least, makes his one bishop a little more active. And these are just moves, but you can see that White's pieces are stuck on lower ranks. There we go, centralizing that piece. Look at that square, look at that square. Just very active. Oh no, now we've got what? This famous situation with everything on the back rank. Very bad sign. Check. Bishop comes back, and now already it's a fork. It's that simple. Fork between these two pieces, and that was really just it. There we go. So now this piece is hanging. So black wins material, and he won. He's going to win even more material after I guess that has to be taken. Right, and now there's problems with this and with this, and you can see that's an easy win for black. So that's a really good example of how to absolutely destroy the pawn chain. Let's real quickly just see those first moves again real fast. Okay, there's that pawn chain, and there's that way of undermining it. And you'll see this also in the f4, e5, d4 pawn structure that we're going to see in a while, where black plays moves like f6 and g5. So imagine that, and if you can't see that in your imagination, we'll get right to it. Now here we have the other reinforced pawn chain structure, with the pawn chain supported, the head of the pawn chain supported from both sides, and that's this characteristic of the French defense. You may notice the structure probably only very occasionally occurs in other openings for white, but actually for black the symmetrical structure appears pretty often, very often in the English opening, the Dutch, perhaps a few other openings. So what's going on here? Well, first of all, it's pretty clear that white wants to play this move. That's his main break, attacking the central support of the pawn chain. We've seen this with our d5, e4 pawn structure with the same idea with c5. This time it's f5. And sometimes he's even going to play with g4. So, and that's going to support the move f5. At other times, white might just be happy with his central advantage, which is huge and hard to break up, and simply expand on the other side of the board to establish even more of a space advantage. Remember, what white's doing is he's grabbing space. Of course, that takes time. So what about black's plans? Black can play this move, which he usually plays that move. In fact, most of his plans start after that move, attacking the central support point on d4, as expected. And then what can he do after that? Well, he can either take on d4, or he can play moves like c4, b5, b4. Now do you recognize that? That's the exact symmetrical equivalent of what black did in the King's Indian defense structure that we looked at just now. This latter plan of playing c4, b5, b4 is not extremely common, because remember that when black did this on the king's side, the king was a target. Whereas on the queen's side, it's very seldom that white's going to be castling queenside in these positions. And if he did, then c4, b5, b4 might be a very good plan, but it doesn't come up very much. So usually black is either going to keep the pressure on this d4 point with this pawn, leave his pawn here, or exchange. So what else? What else can black play here? For example, black can now play, once he gets to this kind of position, what are his options? Well, one option is to play here to hold up white's kingside advance. That's to hold up this kind of move. And that's quite playable. It's played in a fair number of lines. But if white plays, for example, h3 against this plan here, let's just reverse moves there. If he plays this structure, it's going to be very hard. Or even if white plays king here and brings a rook over here and tries to play for this move g4, one thing black probably can't do is play h5. In the symmetrical position in the other structure, the King's Indian structure, if you go back, you'll see that black played both a5 and c5 in order to hold up b4. Black can't do this here. So that doesn't mean that black's doomed or anything, but it just means it's a little harder to meet that kingside attacking plan, that way of attacking the front of the pawn chain. So you don't really see this too much. What else can black play? Black can also play f6. And that's equivalent to what Kasparov was playing in the last game. He even followed it up with a kind of crazy move like that with a reverse position, attacking there, there, and there to break up the pawn chain. So this move with this idea with f6, in fact we can even make it right now, is actually the most popular plan for trying to break up White's pawn chain. Attacking the front of the pawn chain, as we said in the very first lecture, seems a little odd because it can be defended so easily, but in fact it's a very useful thing to do, as we'll see when we see some games. But first we're going to look at a White game, a game for White in this structure. Okay, this is Robert Wade versus Wolfgang Ullmann from Skopje, 1968. Let's just get right with it here. It's a French defense, as expected. And these are normal moves. So what does Black do? He attacks the pawn chain. White defends it. And here we are talking about a reinforced pawn chain again. We're not talking about a pawn chain where the pawn stands here and a knight goes here, which is a more common pawn chain, and we'll look at that next week, or the week after, or both. But let's just continue with this game, just so you can see what we're dealing with. Okay, Black attacks the center, White defends the center. Notice what I said about development. Sometimes when you establish this kind of center, you can fall a little behind on development. Now Black makes an interesting move. It's called the Leningrad system. Maybe it's playable. It's not popular at all anymore. Extremely difficult to play at best. In the old days, instead of focusing on attacking d4 and e5 with a move like this, and maybe a move like this, attacking that way, and this attacking this way, they often used to try to restrain White's advance on the king side and then attack on the queen side. So let's take a quick look at that. White plays that move not just to stop bishop b4 check, but also to gain space on the queen side. So you'll see how that works. Black brings the knight over. Just make a few more moves here. So White's developing smoothly. Black is bringing his pieces to the queen side. There he goes, a very logical move. He's intending, it stops b4, for example, and intends a4. White allows a4. If he did stop, something like this might happen. Here, here, maybe even right away. Probably something like this, thinking about these weak squares here, and then a move like this to get this move in. But if he does it too quickly before he plays g6, I'll show you this variation. White can break with that move he's been looking for to attack the base of the pawn chain. He's got the rook behind it now. He's really prepared for this. He's got the bishop behind it, and the knight's ready to come up here. And let me just give you a quick possibility of how that might go. Takes here. Now the problem is there's some real issues that he has to defend. What I give here is this move, e6. Just for example, here, here, here. Now Black's 2 pawns up, but then take a look at this. With an attack on e6, attack and all of the dark squares. Look at that wonderful outpost for a knight, which is going to in turn attack other things. There's a bishop coming here. There might be a bishop coming here. This is just a huge mess, and if you look at this a bit, just stop the tape, get out of board, you'll find out that this is an impossible position to defend. You can't really even defend the e-pawn effectively. You'll just end up losing it. So a possible sort of way in which this game could go, but instead of that, he allows a4. Okay, that's 2 pawns holding up 1. That 1 pawn holding up 2. Excuse me. That pawn on a4 holds up the ones on a3 and b2. So Black at least is getting some queenside play. White shifts. He could also put the knight over here. That would be a nice way to play. So Black starts aiming at the queenside squares, but really he probably should have been careful because of the move f5 coming, so he probably should have played a simple move like that. Instead, look what happens. The key move that White's been preparing for, attacking in the center, we talked about that. Black takes. Now if Black doesn't take, he's going to get in trouble anyway. What would be an example? If he starts doing that, then knight here. There are threats here, here. That bishop can come over here. And the rook is going to come down here. There are going to be way too many threats there. You can verify that. What else? I mean, you could make a slow move, like a bishop e7, but the same sort of things happen. You just play knight f4 almost no matter what, I think. Okay, so black accepts that, and boom, it doesn't even wait for knight f4, even though that would obviously be a very good move. Maybe it's instructive to just look at that quickly. Knight here. Bishop tries to block e6 because e6 is a huge threat. Here, 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 hitting that square. And just for example, some move like this. You just start crashing through, even at the cost of a piece, because look, that king's going to be stuck in the center. And all these pieces are free now. All these pieces are free to do damage. Just real quickly, that could go here, e6. Thinking about bishop g6 check, there's not much to do about that. So he tries to get castled, but he runs into that instead. And this move, hitting that square here. Suppose you play bishop f7, but instead we're looking at just this easier move. Bishop here, just more direct move. Get all those pieces into the attack. Here, move that there, attacking the queen. It's all with tempo. Tries to block it off, but kaboom. So he just can't block. Just too many pieces in the attack here. If queen c4, then just rook c1. So he would try probably d takes c4 here. Black's simply running out of room to put his pieces in. So, for example, here, check, here, takes, and here. Typical, and that's the end of the game. White's going to mate. Even a rook down, it's very easy to play. So, let's get back to the game. So black ends up taking that pawn, sort of the natural move, but he runs into e6 again. And like I say, knight f4 was very good there, but so is this. Takes, if this takes, well, we've seen something very similar to this. Here, here, maybe here. I guess really has to play f takes e6 here too. And because otherwise just queen g3 and rook e1, right? In other words, something like this, and rook e1 is following. So maybe f takes 6. Let's see if we can go real quickly here with this. Bishop g5. Well, you can see just way too many pieces. This is weak. Bishop b5 check. All this stuff is hanging. Things are just happening too fast. There's no really good place for the queen to go without getting hit by something like that. So let's go back. So he takes with the pawn. Not surprisingly, white plays here. Another good move was bishop g5. A very good move. I could show you some lines of that, but this is getting a little short of time here. Let's see what we can do. The king comes up to defend. White attacks. King's coming. You can see how many great squares white has here, and his pieces are all very active. So he attacks the rook. Now black's going to have to give back some material, and it does it in a way that may not have been quite best, because he really can't play. He takes the bishop to get rid of that good attacking piece. He really can't play here, because then he's going to run into well, I don't know, this first, I guess, and then the problem is this is coming next with a huge attack. So let's go back to the game. So he correctly, this is Wolfgang Willmann, who is a world championship candidate, plays knight takes c1, and now this looks almost like he's sort of getting away, but here's the big attack. Has that idea of winning the queen, and it's kind of nice, some of the little tactics here. He stops that, and white plays this tricky little move. The idea is if he takes, there's going to be a check, then he's going to win the queen. But really, well, probably wasn't even the best move. And I don't know, knight g6 check is even easier, as it turns out. But white's looking for something very cute here, which doesn't happen, but almost. Okay, black attacks. Now, if black decides to try to just make any sort of old move like that, challenging the center, then we get check, here, very beautiful move, because what's wrong here? Isn't the rook just hanging? Well, rook takes. And this is what Wade was after. He wants to play checkmate, or mate in a few moves. Actually, there's a couple ways to do that. And if that gets taken, then here, now he's threatening checkmate. And if the king runs over, check, king comes back, mate. Very, very pretty combination. What happened in the game was this move instead, attacking the queen. So actually, white really would have probably been better off not going. This makes it a little more difficult. But black makes another mistake. That move is really a big mistake. Turns out to be a little better off just playing just something simple like this. And white's better. White can just take that, for example, but it's certainly not yet over. Instead, he plays this move, allowing this nice little check. The problem is if he takes it, well, if he takes it, it's going to be the same as in the game. If he takes it, this is going to happen in King G8. But what happens is King G8 first, I believe. Yeah. And then he goes there, threatening Queen H8, mate, takes, check, King over, and there's White actually played Rook takes B7 here, but he could finish the game very quickly by simply playing this. He won anyway, but this is a very simple way to do it. Threatening Bishop E6 check with mate, threatening Bishop takes G6. Really, that has to be taken. And now Black can simply resign. You can take a look at that if you want to. Queen E6, Rook G5. Way too many threats. Okay. So it's a very nice game, very pretty game, and shows how White can, if White simply gets this pawn structure, sometimes it's just simply very difficult for him. It'd be difficult for the opponent to counteract the cramping influence and the possibilities of advancing on the side. There we go. In this case, on the king side. So Black didn't really ever break up the center. I guess that's the key. Black never attacked these points. Now, sometimes you can get away with that, but in this case, it was too much. And then the breakthrough came with a pawn sacrifice, and all the squares fell down like that. Okay, thank you very much. We'll continue with this subject next week. This has been John Watson with Beyond the Opening, and we'll talk next week.